Thank you for joining Human Capital Gains. Today we are joined by Jason Child of Arm. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. As CFO of Arm, what are your kind of thoughts on this AI revolution that we're living in and how it's going to impact the future of work?
Sure, I would say there's probably two thoughts. I have first thoughts as a company, who kind of provides, I'll just call it the CPU of choice that effectively goes into every hyperscaler and all the core infrastructure providers. So there's how do I think about it first in terms of how do we prepare our business to make sure we can serve our customers, and that's one aspect. But then I would say the other aspect is the same that probably everyone else is dealing with, and that is how is this going to affect my organization, the company, my children, and the world around me. Let me kind of focus a bit on the second one. I would say, it's very clear that it's a pretty significant infrastructure shift. Where if you think about where we were, I mean, when I was at Amazon back in the 2000s, that's when we first kind of birthed the AWS business. And the whole idea was the constraint we saw for e-commerce companies who we wanted to join our marketplace was how do they go and get enough capacity to have whatever they need to maybe run their own website, maybe even ship their own products and whatnot. So we created a couple of products, and of course AWS is one that's probably the most famous, and that created a whole environment around how folks could actually no longer have to deal with buying hardware, but actually now start renting space, via the cloud. And that was a pretty monumental shift. And now all of a sudden we're starting to see this world where folks are now, I mean, you're probably hearing about this approach of the next version of AI where you're buying compute tokens. And a compute token could basically just be any query, a word, letters, partial word, numbers, whatever, and you could sell tokens to all the different model companies or maybe even the ultimate companies, and then they can basically decide. It's almost like fractional computing in a way where they can just buy whatever of power plus compute capability, which all some of it resides on cloud, some of it resides wherever. And so when you think about that, you start to think about how the disruption is pretty significant in terms of how do I actually start thinking about internally how I, allocate resources to go figure out how to deal with. I think the one thing we're not talking a lot about right now is given how fast AI has progressed, how do we start to deal with the constraints that are likely going to hit us soon? And so things like power constraints, cost constraints, time to deploy, and ultimately how to make sure the technology works. So that certainly is a concern that we have for the first aspect of us serving customers. But then second, how do I also make sure as a customer of AI, how do I make sure my reliance is also going to be such that I'm not going to be constrained by some of these other aspects that might all of a sudden make my model, which is relatively low cost and free today, or very low cost today, might become more expensive and it might become more constrained. And so those are all really interesting challenges that I think a lot of us just haven't really thought about in the past.
I think that's really interesting because we talk to companies all the time that are sort of experimenting with AI, right? And sort of the generic strategy is just like, let's just get people AI literate and let's just have them play with the tools. Now we're rapidly approaching this reality. I would say the reality is here where the tools you can like play with have become much more easier to use, much more powerful and potentially much more expensive, right? It's like one thing I would say like 6 months ago, it was like, how do I do better prompt engineering for like generative AI, right? And now it's like you can reverse prompt things to build full on applications in like Google AI Studio, for example, right? And instead of like everything being contained within this like generative AI sort of program, now to your point, now they're opening up this whole universe of buying tokens and calling on APIs, and that creates all these security issues. And I've heard stories about people experimenting with OpenClaw, and then all of a sudden at the end of the month they get like a $800 bill from Google because of all the API usage that they've had. I think we need to fundamentally rethink about what does it mean to experiment and how do we experiment, because it's becoming so much easier to get in really, really big trouble, really big, expensive security trouble relatively quickly.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. The last 3 years has been so much of a focus on accelerated compute, and in particular the GPU or the XPU, but it's mostly been one company, which has been the GPU. And they've basically been digesting, we'll just call it the world's information. And so that has been a highly intensive compute workload or set of workloads, and honestly been a very expensive, because I think to create the intelligence, there's a lot of unintelligent information that you have to sift through to figure out where the intelligence is. And so I think what's going to be really interesting over these next couple of years, we're now starting to see, and this is where we spend a lot of time, because we if you look at NVIDIA, for example, Grace Blackwell, which is kind of the I will call it the accelerated compute hardware of choice. Grace is the CPU that's built on ARM. Next generation will be called Vera Rubin. Blackwell is the GPU that NVIDIA builds. Vera is the next generation CPU built on ARM, and then Rubin is the next generation GPU. And so what's interesting is when you kind of break down the workloads, the training and a lot of the intelligence creation is really coming out of the GPU. But as you now get into agentic AI, which is a lot of, say, OpenClaw is a great example of agents and bots basically working with each other to create things. Every agent is actually a CPU workload. And so then as a result, we're going to start to see a lot more focus on how are we deploying the right amount of CPUs, and in particular the CPU core. There's a technology that involves the number of cores that go into a chip that then determine how many CPU workloads can be basically contemplated or addressed at the same time. That starts to, and that's a big hardware challenge that we've seen things change very quickly. For example, AWS Graviton, which is built on ARM, the last version, I think version 4, I believe, was 88 cores. The new version, Graviton 5, that they just released a couple months ago, that's 192 cores. So, over doubled it in one shot. And the reason why was they were seeing the agentic workloads start to skyrocket. And so I think you're going to see, in our understanding from what we kind of hear from all the hyperscalers, whether it's Google, Microsoft, even NVIDIA, as well as Meta and Amazon, they're all saying the same thing. We need to dramatically increase core counts because we have to basically figure out how to free up the I'd say the agentic AI or the bots and the agents that are actually doing all the work. And so right now there is some constraint in part because of core count. And so what will be interesting is to what extent do we start to see a shift from all of this intelligence creation and large language models to now you're now hearing the terms of small language models. And that is, how do I make sure that I take out all the stuff that's not useful and shrink the corpus of the intelligence just around the highest quality information, that we know is verified and trustworthy. So, for example, if it's in the medical community, how do you shrink it to the NIH and New England Journal of Medicine and all the different core, inputs to medicine that the establishment completely trusts? And then how do we maybe we keep WebMD and a lot of the core information that sources that, but we're probably going to get rid of a lot of the so-called charlatans that are practicing online that promise a bunch of stuff, but they're not doctors, or they don't have verified data that's been verified by a proper AB or control test. And so you can envision how that could really change the world. It could help a lot on shrinking compute needs, but this is all happening very quickly. and so what I'm looking at right now is, you mentioned OpenClaw, fascinating. That was this, kind of fundamental shift with the new models that both came from Anthropic and OpenAI in early February. Those were the first models my understanding is the first models that the AI actually helped make the next version. And so the first models where we're now starting to see the agents and the intelligence start to actually help iterate on itself. And that's a pretty exciting, but also a little bit scary kind of a concept, because it does mean that it truly is that the intelligence can actually accelerate, perhaps exponentially. And so that also means compute needs can accelerate exponentially. And so I think this notion of how do we make sure that we're not just ungating all compute for all questions, but how do we make sure we start to align it with the most valuable questions? And how do you make sure the prompt is as effective as possible to to actually answer exactly what you're wanting to answer. As we all know, if with the wrong prompt, you can end up with a whole bunch of whatever, and you can burn up a lot of unnecessary compute. And so I think that's going to be a challenge that we start to hear a lot about over the coming months.
With how rapid change is coming, we talk to a lot of businesses that are struggling, kind of like adapting to the change, right? What's your suggestion to how businesses can best position themselves, I guess, this year to prepare for these coming changes? Where do they need to kind of like maintain agility?
Yeah, it's a challenge, I think, right now. If I just look at Arm, we have a large engagement with one of the model companies, and we have full access to everything. And we have almost 10,000 employees, and I want to say 90+% of them are engaging with the most advanced version of the model on a daily basis, and many folks for many hours a day. And in part, this has been really helpful for us because it's helping us also get, I think, more conviction and understanding about how you can use this. Internally, we talk a lot about how AI is almost becoming. I've heard some people say it's becoming the best sparring partner, the best coach. It's a college professor of every subject of everything in the world. It's almost a little bit, it's kind of awe-inspiring in terms of how much it provides. But then it also, of course, has the capability to just send you down rabbit holes and go, some of us, might obsess about things to the point where it's completely unnecessary. And so the question then is, but then what I'm seeing the model companies having to do is they're starting to slow how fast they answer your question for obvious reasons. They have constraints, and if someone says go build me reconstruct whatever the most advanced scientific journal in some derivative approach, like that could take a lot of compute, and like, why is it really necessary? And so I think it's basically just starting to sort the workloads and kind of make sure that the more novel, complicated questions you're asking is starting to take longer to answer that, because those guys also have to rationalize all of the costs and the compute needs that they have. So there's some natural gating mechanism there, but I still think we're very early in that process. And so one of the things I'm thinking about internally in the company is how do we make sure that we don't just have everyone go and create their own agent to go address whatever they want. To me, it's almost a little bit, I would say it's similar to financial reporting. You remember when we first got Tableau or first got all these different really great tools that allowed us to create, different dashboards or financial dashboards, financial reports, whatever. And it was great that you could go do this without having to contact a programmer or someone that had to go do all the heavy lifting for you. Well, the problem is then pretty soon you had 150 reports all to answer 5 questions. And then the question was, well, shoot, which one's the right one? Which one's the most accurate? Which one was designed the way, that it was inclusive of all the information and not just one particular area or maybe the person only cared about. And so then what kind of really is, quote, the source of truth? Which one's the right one I can rely on? And so I see AI, we're in this world right now where we're struggling to make sure that we are having the right prompts, creating the right agents, and thinking not just about a particular problem I have, but how do I think? And this is where I think it's really helpful to have computer scientists, even though the computer scientists are now doing less coding. For a while, they're doing vibe coding. Now I'm told that agentic AI is actually far more efficient than vibe coding. It creates less problems. But the problem is only if you have the prompt exactly right. And the prompt has to be very, very well thought through. And so what we're starting to do is now have almost kind of a gatekeeper around what is the problem you're trying to solve? How do I go and actually research that I get the exact right prompt? Because a lot of the prompts actually have already been created. So how do I search for the right prompt to get exactly the right answer? Which that whole concept didn't even exist probably a couple months ago. And now all of a sudden that's becoming like a key aspect for us.
We had a guest on the show, Nelson Repenning, who wrote a book, There's Got to Be a Better Way, MIT professor. And he's kind of he talks about, one of the things that plagues organizations is that the work itself doesn't work. So we spend a lot of time or a lot of effort just on workarounds, right? And then my question to him is like, do we face like a danger right now where people are essentially using AI? It's like a supercharged workaround agent within your business. So to your point, like, you go in and everyone's sort of vision on a generic basis when it comes to this stuff is like, we're going to come in, we're going to discover some stuff, and then we're going to standardize it and scale it throughout the entire organization. And then, so my question is like, is the strategy that people are taking just not only not enable that, but destroy that sort of future where if you have, the three of us are working together and now all of a sudden each one of us basically have permission to go build our own workarounds in the system as we see fit. So now instead of three ways of doing things, I've got like 5 agents doing one thing. Gary's got 6, you've got 12. Yeah. Now we've got like, a bazillion different ways of doing the same stuff. And then how do you standardize and scale the work if now there's all these forks in the road? And then the other thing too is, like I said, as people are experimenting with more and more expensive tools, is there the possibility that we're not saving money because the cost of one Gary might be cheaper than the cost of running 8 agents that Gary has created that are burning through API tokens like mad?
Yeah. Well, so I think the problem will largely sort itself over time and possibly in near term, as I think the model companies are going to start rationalizing the pricing probably based on usage. They are to some extent today, but they haven't done much yet. They're obviously very, very focused on just gaining adoption as much as possible. And I think they're following kind of the old school of, do the freemium model and offer as much capability as possible for free. And try to, reduce any sort of friction and economic kind of friction, especially to get usage. And then once you get more data, once you get more usage, you get more understanding, more buy-in that kind of creates that virtuous cycle of usage. And then that's probably when, in other words, when you're hooked, that's when pricing will probably start to become, we heard the CFO of OpenAI talk about how they might be, asking for a cut of the revenue of whatever, solutions they and outcomes they create through AI, which caused a little bit of a hey, wait a minute moment. But it seems obvious to me that it's some version of that is probably what happens over time, anyways. So I think right now we're in this kind of chaotic landscape of experimentation, trying out and trying to figure out where things are going to go. I'm a huge fan of Nelson's work. I actually do have the book, by the way, and I haven't finished it, but everything I've read in it ties to my experience as well, which is like really spending time to figure out the problem you're solving. You should spend a lot more time on that, and then a lot less time on all the busy work around process mapping and reintroducing, transformation and tools and all that kind of stuff, because a lot of the consultants or folks that you might bring in, they get paid generally. Their incentive is to implement a tool. And of course they want it to work right, but they're not really going to live with it. You're going to live with it. And so I think we're in an interesting time. I feel like it's moving very, very quickly. So kind of what we're doing within our company is really trying to provide a gatekeeping function where we kind of have all the requests on how to use AI. We have an AI kind of a project management office, I guess, for like our program management office, for lack of a better term. And they basically will digest and kind of create the funnel of all the different requests, try to figure out which ones are consistent and which ones can you combine. And then how do we take kind of the subject matter experts around how to create the right prompt to go and solve some of these different problems. The other thing I would say is AI is getting, in the past, I think it was much more about machine learning. It was mostly like algorithms that just kind of filter information. So like one of the examples I talk about is when I was at Amazon, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone was amazed at this amazing website that could give you the best recommendation for products. And it was like, well, that was not AI, that was machine learning. And that was for anyone who bought these 5 books, they typically probably wanted to read this other book because, regardless of whatever your demographic was, your interests are going to be aligned, that if you like Nelson's book, you might like, one of his earlier books or one of his peers who's written on a similar subject. And it just helps you find that as fast as possible. That's machine learning. It's not really intelligence. It's just basically, it's just an algorithmic combination of what other behaviors, how they kind of, look similar. I do think we're getting really close to actually having some true intelligence, as evidenced by, the stuff we've seen in the newest models from both OpenAI and Anthropic, as well as, what OpenClaw and some of these others are actually showing that bots can start to manage other bots, or agents can manage other agents, and start proofing and verifying work and finding mistakes and, things that I would say are definitely not just machine learning, they are true intelligence. So I think as we start to go further down that paradigm, we will start to see things change. But today, I think most of us, especially I'm a CFO, I look at AI and say it's mostly a probabilistic model versus deterministic, and that is it's going to give you the highest likely answer based on whatever your prompt is, but it still could be wrong. And that's where we, of course, know all about hallucinations. Now, hallucinations are significantly reducing, but they still exist. And so if you're in an area like finance where we are, we get a pass fail for providing deterministic answers to questions. Are the financials accurate? Is the revenue correct? Does the revenue related to a certain deal based on the terms, is it exactly right? Does it follow ASC 606? And, like right now, AI isn't quite ready to give you that 100% certainty. It'll give you a 90 something percent certainty, but that's not enough. And so what I'm finding is where we use AI today is like, it's great for like right now in internal audit. That's an area where we're using AI a lot, where we can basically say, hey, go and compare some transaction logs with another transaction log. And instead of having to theoretically like sample, which is what we always had to do in the past because you couldn't look at everything. With AI, you actually can look at everything. You can just say, look at everything in this database compared to that database and go see if there was differences in something that was missed. And all of a sudden, then, the internal audit team, where it took 3 people in a whole week to go test a sample, in a few hours, they can look at 100% and then go test if there's any differences. And so like, that's a really good answer. In that case, it is deterministic. They're just comparing things. And the answer is there a gap between those two databases? So I think what we're trying to do is work from the easier use cases. And then eventually you're going to get to the much harder ones that are like, hey, go build me an ERP that can be just as good as SAP and that an auditor will rely on. Like that's a ways away. Like we have a lot of work to do before we get there.
At what point do you feel that, we talk about AI as an operating system, right? And, I've recently heard a couple opinions on that, like when are we replacing some of like the large CRM systems, the large ERP systems? How far away do you think we are from that?
The framework that myself and my team, we just had an offsite in the last week and we were going through this exact question, that we kind of put together this list of what are the things that you possibly replace from near term to farthest away. And what I would say is something that is a key requirement that our auditors have spent years testing and therefore already rely and are fine with that. So SAP is a pretty good example of something that's probably about the safest thing I can think of in terms of we're the farthest away from that. But that's as a large public company that is registered in the US Stock Exchange, but also has to provide, IFRS reporting in other countries. And so there's a lot of machinery that's been built for that. So I see that as being your most complicated use case, and that's probably the farthest out. The simplest use case is probably going to be I'm using, and I won't get into which technologies they are for obvious reasons, but technologies that are just doing contact management between companies. So I'm just chatting between functions. So that's just an information repository. That stuff is just purely internal. It just has to be, and both sides can tell very quickly if it's accurate. Is it restating everything I said? Did it take notes of a meeting and it captured the notes correctly? Can I have my assistants now no longer bother with doing my calendar and free them up to do something else? And maybe I can have assistant handle more people because I can use a calendar app to take care of that workload. So I think it's more about these simple workloads that are probably internal, not requiring like some SOX or auditor or some sort of a compliance or ISO 9001 or whatever. If I don't need that stuff, so things like maybe even reporting tools internally, things that are comparing databases but they're not being used for external reporting. Those are all the things that I will say my team is experimenting with now, and I think those are the areas where there's a lot of opportunity today.
Yeah. So it's like low risk tasks that aren't necessarily like high value to the company that take a decent amount of time. I mean, when I say not high value, I don't mean like they're not important, but I'm saying like they don't generate value within the business.
Yeah, you could say like reconciliations. It's a lot of busy work to go and compare something and look line by line. AI should be able to do that very, very well. Contact management. I mean, call centers, of course, is one of the first use cases. I remember when we went through this at Amazon. We had all these problems with call centers, and we basically said we're gonna make it all self-serve, and everyone thought that was really anti-customer. And what it turned out was, would you rather wait 5 minutes on a call with a 50% chance that the rep's going to help you? Or would you rather be able to go to a system and already knows the top 5 reasons that cover 95% of why someone calls? You just pick which one. Why am I calling? In fact, it's funny. In like 2000, we created Where's My Stuff, because that was 80% of why people reached out. And then we actually had to work with FedEx, UPS, and the Postal Service to say, hey, you should let people know where the package is. And they were like, oh, I mean, like right now, you're like, what? That didn't exist. And no, it was like, and once you did that, you literally eliminated 80 some odd percent of all the contacts, and people could get their answer in seconds. And that's far more satisfying than sitting on hold and having a nice discussion with someone that generally leads nowhere.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, and so, yeah.
Like, oh, generally it takes 5 to 7 days. It's only been 4, so it should be there within the next 2 to 3.
Right.
And now you're like,
But
it's in Bloomington, Indiana, and it's been for 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. In other words, the rep was giving you a probabilistic answer, and the Where's My Stuff now gives you a deterministic answer as to exactly where it sits. Yeah. And the funny thing is all that technology was built for that. I mean, internally they had to know it anyways. And so the reality wasn't like, FedEx and UPS didn't have the capability. They just didn't actually expose the information. And so it didn't take that long to surface the information and share the API. But it was just like a good example of things that are now so obvious that were new and enabled by technology.
So a lot of companies, that we talk to, one of the, we'll loosely call it strategies of how they're implementing AI is, they buy, enterprise-wide access to whatever, prevailing software, or whatever prevailing model is out there. And it's, we let 1,000 flowers bloom and we pick the prettiest one, right? Like hoping that they're going to kind of like stumble upon some use cases. Earlier in our conversation, you had said that there's almost an above 90% adoption rate of usage within ARM of AI. How were you successful in mitigating that? And kind of where have you seen successes with that adoption rate?
Let me answer your question with a different analog that I think will help answer it. But we were looking at implementing a contract lifecycle management system, a tool that was kind of a new AI-based tool about a year ago. And we were getting blocked because the legal team said, look, we're an IP company and we have to be very careful about which information gets exposed. And we have a lot of, very sensitive IP data, and so we kind of went around in circles, and the team that also had access to ChatGPT and also actually had access to another application, which is just about workflow management. And they basically in a week created a tool that mimicked exactly what this other tool did. But what they did was they took the two different constituents. One really wanted, the legal team really wanted a certain thing. The revenue recognition team really wanted some other things. And the, I'll call it the sales op teams that's actually negotiating the contracts, they wanted some different things. And the reality is when you went through the requirements of each of the different platforms that existed, because we're looking at a few, none of them solved all of it. You had to pick which one mattered most. Meanwhile, in the AI, we just said, why don't you do all three of these things? And they were able to build it within a week. And therefore, we weren't having to make a trade-off. And so to me, it's a little bit of an example of, does your company use Slack or Teams? Well, some people really like Slack. Some people really like Teams. Well, what if somewhere in the future, you basically just said, I'm going to take the best of both and have my own internal version, and then maybe even something extra that our specific workforce really wants to have, but it's too expensive to build or buy that modification. And so we'll just do it on our own. That's where I think, agentic AI really, really could threaten a lot of the incumbents. Now, you could also argue maybe the incumbents who have a really good platform, Slack and Teams are excellent products. What if they have agentic AI so they could say, we can actually tweak the software for you much simpler than we did in the past? And I would imagine that's going to be their challenge and their opportunity to be able to preserve their business.
Like that hyper personalization is kind of what everyone's getting to, that N of one.
Yep. Exactly.
So as we talk about kind of like advancements in AI, what's your meter, how you differentiate from kind of like the hype and the noise and the actual kind of like, the wheat from the chaff? And how are you strategically planning your workforce development around that?
It's a great question. And it's kind of the question, I think, especially as I talk to other CFOs. or if I read some of the skepticism, there's plenty of skepticism. And a lot of the skepticism is around what is the hard ROI measurement that shows you that you're getting success? And so, as the CFO, it's pretty easy. I look at it and say, how fast is my business going? So we're growing, call it 20, 25% annually for the last 3 or 4 years. And that's kind of the expectation for the near future. What is our cost growth and our headcount growth? And so right now, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the G&A team. And last year we spent a lot of time, and I'll call it SG&A. So sales, HR, finance, IT, all the functions that are supporting the business. Our growth in those functions is about 8% year on year, even though the business is growing 20 some odd percent. The engineering team is growing much faster, but that's because they're building products for the future. And so that is at least one. And then I go in and I look at each of the different functions and I look for what are the automations, ML or AI use cases that have been implemented, and how does that translate into kind of productivity in terms of amount of throughput that team can process relative to the amount of heads they have. So that's generally what I've been looking for. And because when I start saying, "Hey, give me the examples of the tools you're using," you get a lot of like, "I built this really cool thing. It's helping me do this, that, and the other." And you're like, "Oh, okay. So does that mean people are all going home on Thursday instead of Friday, or like what does it mean?" And that gets really, really hard because it ends up being like, well, I'm probably providing a higher quality output, or you start getting these subjective things. And so I think to me overall it's really just about, are we improving cycle time? So are we like reducing the time frame to process something? Are we increasing, throughput? So can we process more transactions, the same amount of people? And then do we have the same or better level of kind of accuracy, or reducing defects that somehow make it through the process? And so those things I have seen, I would say material progress over the last year. I will say it's hard to say how much is automation versus, like robotic, RPA, robotic process automation. Great. How much of that is AI versus just automation? We can debate that. Then there's, well, how much is machine learning versus AI? Could debate that as well. So I get less kind of stuck on probably the nomenclature, other than just how are we doing at improving, kind of the cycle time, the throughput, and the defect reduction. I would say the thing that we're probably, the thing I'm worried about is, we read all about power capacity, data centers, and chip capacity, and fab capacity. Now there's memory capacity issues. And so all these things mean that as people get more and more addicted or reliant upon some of these different tools, to what extent are we not going to have so much experimentation at a low cost available? And when are we going to have to actually start really, instead of like right now, there's a lot of shotguns being used. Instead, we might have to go to sniper fire or rifles and target shooting. And that probably will require that folks get a little more disciplined in experimentation, which may mean you start to, I think that's probably going to be good for everybody, but I think it's gonna hit us here pretty soon.
Yeah, we really evaluate. We talk to a lot of people about evaluating, their process moving forward too, against, automation versus augmentation, and what does efficiency look like. So Jason, we're coming up on time. As we close this out, biggest piece of advice for a CEO that's looking to implement AI, what is the one thing that you would tell them from the CFO lens that they should think of first?
Yeah, I guess I would say from my experience, I would first probably focus on having a person or team that can be the expert and be kind of the funnel, because the shotgun approach of allowing folks to experiment across the board, I think it's fine for interacting with the tool for whatever reasons, but when you're actually trying to find like enterprise grade solutions that will actually help make sure that teams aren't just getting distracted, and are actually building things that are actually going to all lead to success, which of course is, a CEO really cares about resource allocation and outcomes. And so I think having a team that can be the starting point, I think is really, really helpful. It's something that we did about a year ago, and it's been incredibly helpful. And of course, that team is way oversubscribed. And so then you have challenges about how do you kind of prioritize all that kind of stuff. But it's a high class problem, I think. So that's first. I would say second, I do think it's really, really helpful to get a cross-company enterprise-grade product. You've probably heard, like, whatever you do, don't just go use the free model or the less expensive model, because less expensive means older and less intelligent. And so I do think whatever tools, whether it's a general model or whatever AI you're going to use, make sure you're paying the right amount for the right tool for the job. And don't let the CFO tell you to go use the cheap model, because cheap means it generally means it's just, it's like what do they say, the free models of the large models companies are typically equal to somewhere around like junior high level of intelligence, whereas the paid model is a PhD. You probably want the PhD. That's, I would say, second. And then I would say, and then I think third is probably, then, like, one of the things we're actually now in the process of doing is we have that AI group that's kind of the funnel. Then you have the models that everyone has access to. Now what we're doing is we're creating what we're calling an AI native operations team, which is basically, think of them as being more the transformation of workflow and process folks that really understand that stuff. They understand AI, but the IT team, where you have a bunch of folks that are, who spent years just, using the AI apps, they really know what the pros and cons of every model is. You kind of want to have those teams be able to work together, because if you ask the AI people just go work with the team and go build whatever they want to build, you may find that each person's individual use case can get solved with AI, but they're not thinking across a full process from end to end, and that is a different mindset. And so whether or not, I personally think you want to do that inside the company versus license it to a consultant, because there's so much information and learning that happens that you hate to kind of let that knowledge walk out the door. And so that third group for us is kind of where we're at. And I think across those three dimensions, we found those are kind of, we've tried a number of different things, but those different three things is what we have had the most success with thus far, and I think would be a good place to start.
Jason, it's invaluable advice for all of our listeners, and I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. All right.